conferencia de este día con el profesor Alain Parguez. Y recuerden que vamos a tener un receso. Después vienen las preguntas para que vayan escribiendo sus preguntas. Y en la tarde no se olviden que tenemos la presentación de los libros. Alan.
Thank you very much. Alicia, it is a paper that could be translated. It is
Okay.
Today
No he visto que hayan puesto.
I have to speak of one of the most misunderstood question in both economic theory and economic policy, how the state finance its expenditures and what is the impact. I shall try to be as simple as possible. In the first part, I shall deal with a logical model which could be deemed the existence condition of a stable, dynamic economy, targeting in the long run welfare and true full employment. In the second part, I have to deal how that crucial stability condition has been destroyed in the modern economy, absolutely destroyed in the European Monetary Union and United Kingdom, not yet entirely destroyed in the US. It is why, since the start, I was a dedicated opponent to the Euro and the European Monetary Union. But let us first address the stable system. There are three questions to be raised. First, how the state is financing its expenditures and what is the role of taxes. I shall explain why, for a very long time, I have been with very few good people, including my friend Jan Toporowski, that taxes, of course, finance nothing. they provide no resources to the state. Second question, what about the deficit? Must the state balance its budget? I would say, of course, no. Must there be limits to the so-called deficit? Of course, no. As long, indeed, as the counterpart of the state next expenditures is public investment in the creation of real wealth, including human capital. Third question, do the state needs to issue bonds to finance its deficit? No. Thereby, why is the state issuing bonds? I will say and prove that the issue of bonds is some kind of social security for the banking system. It is not financing nothing. Last question, is the state obliged to sell bonds to foreigners? Of course not. Which means that in a stable and dynamic system, the state must have an absolute sovereignty on its currency. It is why I agree on this question with the so-called modern monetary theory people, Warren Mosler, Randy Ray, and Matthew Forstater. But I shall start, if you allow me, with a bit of history. Before the early 70s of the 20th century, and even during the gold standard era, all great European states were always bearing a large deficit. Nobody ever raised the least question about the fact that using the modern way of computing deficits around the ratio of the public debt to national income was very high, much higher than in most, for instance, European countries. 90% of the Greek budget was covered by the issue of debt sold to French banks, English banks, German banks. Nobody was ever worried by that fact. Around 95% of the budget of Imperial Russia was covered by debt, sold to the same banks. Nobody was ever worried. In 1913, around 70% of assets of the largest French, German, and English banks was public debt. Henri Germain, the founder of the Crédit Lyonnais, wrote in 1913, a good banker must only hold sound assets, which means state debt. He must never hold private debt. And even Jean-Pierre Pot Morgan, the founder of modern finance, wrote around the same time, I have only one certainty: the soundest assets are public debt. Only stupid people could ever believe that a state could be bankrupt. And we were at the time of the gold standard. So something happened. Why now that kind of psychomania, psychotic hate of the public debt, deficits, fear of state bankruptcy, which never existed before? It is connected with the problem I shall address in another speech. Never before the 70s, the state imposed long-run policy of deflation, which means austerity. Never. And indeed, there was at that time a continuous growth of public expenditures. How were railways, the Suez and the Panama Canal, British Navy, development of education financed by public expenditures. So, even when you look at the so-called early liberals, they were absolutely not interested into reducing public expenditures. Indeed, as long as they were productive. So, let us go back now to logical and empirical principles. No stable system ever existed without the state. I should go back to this question. The increase in state expenditures and state net expenditures, which means deficit, is the sine qua non, the existence condition of stability, full employment, and welfare. Thereby, the state is a full partner of the monetary circuit. Thereby, when the state decides to spend so as to promote the creation of real wealth by hiring labor or buying directly a share of equipment good, the state cannot wait taxes. For the same reason that private firms cannot spend out of their future receipts and profits, which do not exist when they spend, taxes are raised on national income, thereby the state cannot finance its expenditures by taxes. It is the worst stupidity to believe that taxes are used to finance expenditures. We are no more in the variation model where everything happens at the same time. So, the state is financing its aggregate expenditures out of money creation. With the intermediary of the central bank, which like private banks are banks of the private sector. How is the state creating money? As soon as the state wires money to pay for labor or for commodities, there is an automatic increase in the private deposits of sellers of services and commodities in private banks' assets. Thereby, there is an automatic increase in the creation of money. And the counterpart in banks' balance sheet is what could be deemed a claim on the state, a pure conventional claim on the state to respect the law of accounting. But in modern economies, at the same time, banks acquire debts issued by the central bank, the reserves, in terms of basic accounting. Thereby, ultimately, we could say that the central bank, as the bank of the state, is the source of money creation, which is instantaneously transformed into productive expenditures by the state. At that time, taxes cannot be raised, because on what could taxes be raised? When are intervening taxation? When, thanks to initial expenditures of firms, household out of indebtedness, and state expenditures, national income, aggregate gross income has been created. At that time, a share of gross income is diverted to the payment of taxes. And what is the impact of taxes? And that could be checked by looking at the balance sheet, even now, of the Federal Reserve System in the US. The payment of taxes is destroying, cancelling income and money. I entirely agree. I proved that proposition a long time ago in a paper published in 2002. Taxes destroy money, and the state thereby cannot finance new expenditures out of money which is destroyed. It means that what is the use of taxes in modern economy, whatever they are, and now enters the deficit question. First, as I told briefly, the term deficit was never used or very or only for pure political debates in the 19th century. It appears in the interwar period. By the way, deficit is like austerity, a concept which has been borrowed to the most conservative Catholic theology. In St. Augustine, the city of God, what means deficit? The lack of communication with God. And austerity was indeed also a theological concept. Since true life is the afterlife, you must suffer to enjoy your afterlife. So it is extremely interesting that modern economics is relying on the theology of St. Augustine, a great theologian, but who lived in another era. So, deficit is the excess of initial state expenditures over what has been cancelled by taxation. It is a net state expenditures. Thereby, when the state runs a deficit, and this is a basic accounting, the private sector as a whole is enjoying a surplus. When, so this had been understood by Keynes, the exact page in the paper I gave you. The state deficit is this saving by the state, but it is the creation of net savings for the private sector. If the state wants to balance the budget, the private sector cannot accumulate saving. And if the state is running a surplus, it is this saving, destruction of saving for the private sector. Thereby, what are the conclusions of that analysis I have to simplify? First, those who never stop to cry, but how could you finance your deficit? But they are stupid. Since the deficit is part of initial expenditures, it is obviously already financed. We are no more in the Greece just after its independence, as far as I know. I would address the question of the impact on the foreign sector later. Thereby, why is the state issuing bonds? Certainly not to finance something which is already financed. The state is issuing bonds in a normal system for two reasons. First, to provide private banks with a stable source of net wealth out of the interest rate decreed by the Treasury, which is indeed an income for banks, and because in that normal system, since the state is not constrained in its ability to spend, it cannot, will not default. Repayments of the debt, payments of interest are included into the initial expenditures. Thereby, private agents, yes, they can default, they could be bankrupt. It is not the case of the state. Thereby, by providing banks with sound assets, banks is wanting, protecting the banks against bankruptcy. But there is more. Because I have been indeed accused like the friends I mentioned, of being some kind of addicted to spendthrift state. No. There must be a distinction between two kinds of deficits. What could be deemed the good or productive deficits? Deficits which are targeted in the long run state planning, and which are the counterpart of public investment in the creation of real wealth, creation of real capital, creation of human capital, which means wanting the growth of the value of the labor force. Thereby, assets held by bank, they do have a real value, which is the increase, to be simple, in the rate of growth of the global economy. Some people are surprised, but as had been written by the old friend of mine, Robert Eisner, in his two contributions to the theory of public finance, people are not shocked when the financial sector, why not the drug sector, is included into the GDP. When the state is hiring teachers, whatever the level of education, when the state is hiring researchers to promote the best possible future, even when the state is hiring people working for the fight against pollution, it is investment. Thereby, one of the most absurdity or infamy of modern orthodox ideology is such a hate or contempt for public servants. And thereby, if we go back to what I said yesterday about the employment function of the private sector, taking care even in a stable economy that private agents can never suppress their anguish of the future because they cannot plan for a future which doesn't exist. The more the state is rising planned and good deficit, the more firms will enjoy aggregate profits. This had been already said by Kaletsky, even by Rosa Luxemburg. The more there will be an increase in true employment and decrease in true unemployment, the more a rise in consumption and the more private firms will be induced to invest. Again, chapter 16 of the general theory, finally, there is only one sole motive for investment, the expected rise in private consumption, and I would say in private net deficit. But there is more. The more firms are because of state net investment and creation of money optimistic relative to the future, the more they are ready to accept a lower share of profit and a lower rate of profit, thereby a new source of creation of employment and stabilization of the economy. But there are bad deficits. And what are bad deficits? Deficits which are not the counterpart of creation of real wealth, which is the case for a part of war expenditures, but mainly deficits which are the outcome of austerity policies. The paradox is that the more politicians or financial markets or orthodox economists impose a decrease in expenditures or an increase in taxation, the more the economy will drop into a spiraling deflation, which is the case now. The outcome will be a collapse of tax revenue and contribution, thereby unwanted deficit, and if the state reacts by more austerity, we are near the end of the economy, and it is exactly what is happening now. I will go back to this question later. There remains two questions. Why? The first is why the so-called orthodox economy, which by the way is a pure Catholic concept. Orthodox is the way to God. Are that first reluctant and now deficit and state spending haters. I say there are many reasons. First, I could say because they are more and more living in a fantasy world, a world which never existed and will never exist, the world of general equilibrium theory, which is only some pseudo algebraic mathematical games, and in which there cannot be any question about the necessity of growth, welfare, or full employment. Indeed, they are no more pretending that reducing the state ability to spend, destroying the state, will promote investment and raise employment by the private sector. Only the most stupid politicians say that. If they believe that is another question. The second reason is that they can no more be deemed neoliberals or liberal at all, or they could be deemed archeo-liberal, neo-feudal liberal. They are indeed under the spell of the reactionary ideology coming from Austrian economics, Friedrich Hayek, who influenced Alan Greenspan, Bernanke, through a bizarre connection, a Russian philosopher who emigrated after the revolution to the US, Ayn Rand, R-A-N-D, who was, by the way, the mistress of Alain Greenspan, and who was a die-hard fanatic. So what is liberal economy? What is, for Hayek, an economy where people are free? It is an economy where people are completely enslaved to the so-called market laws, which means to the will of the rulers of the private sector. In that system, the elected parliament should vanish, be deprived of any power, and all the power should be transferred to a restricted elite, completely independent of the people, of pure technocrats, technicians, ruling without any counterpower the people. So you are free when you are deprived of any freedom. Hayek, Alan Greenspan, Robert Barrow were asked at different times, but what are market laws? And they said, if you raise the question, you are not an economist. So, now, what is going on is the destruction of the state. I shall go back to this question, out of austerity. Some kind of totalitarian system in which all possibility of discussing what is going on is forbidden. The best definition I am aware of the new system had been given by the late French President François Mitterrand. François Mitterrand said, what is the best system? When people are free to speak, but when nobody is able to hear themselves. Some kind of a prophet preaching in the desert. Now, there remains a complex question which is connected with international economy. More and more politicians, conservative economists say, but what is destroying growth is China, so why not declare war to China? It is an old story. The first who wrote the ghost of China as a threat for the Western world was the late Kaiser Wilhelm II in 1909. The Yellow Thread, it was a book. And why are the Chinese able to destroy, and why do the modern state do nothing to prevent the Chinese or the Yellow Thread? Is because their deficit is financed by China. So the American people or the Mexican people or the French people are so addicted to consumption that finally they are financed by loans from China. And there is more. Wall Street is afraid or pretends to be afraid that the Chinese could be asked to be repaid in euro. But I have not the time now to discuss both the contradiction and the absurdity of the so-called competition from China. Because you are for free trade or not. If you are to free trade, why impose quotas, tariffs on the Chinese? It's a bit absurd. Second, they say, but the Chinese maintain an artificial rate of exchange. So, they are subsidizing their export industry. I don't think it is true. I shall go back in the question if you want. And people forget that who created, who decided Deng Xiaoping to turn to export policy? Friedman and Bernanke himself, when just after Beijing, in Tiananmen, they were invited by Deng Xiaoping as a state a guest of the state. Chinese industry was created and largely financed by investment from the United States, Canada, and Europe. Many people forget that when you look at the Chinese balance of payment, which is not an easy job, yes, China is holding debts issued by other countries, but it is still indebted toward the private sector. And there is an enormous outflow of capital to the US, Europe, Canada, Australia, as a counterpart of profits. So now let us go back to this question of the Chinese are financing the orgy of consumption. I know prominent technocrats in Europe, they said they hate the young people because of their luxury consumption, and who finance them? China. No. We could discuss the ideology of those gerontocracy, but this is for another time. No. It is true that since Europe, the second largest power in the world in economic terms, has rather a trade balance in equilibrium. The sole possibility for China to get a surplus is import from the United States. But I looked at the US balance of payment. Yes, there is a deficit with China, but there is a drop in this deficit, and it represents only 10% of the trade deficit. The United States deficit is mainly relative to producers of raw materials Canada, and indeed oil producers. Now, what is the relationship between the state deficit and the trade deficit? It is not an automatic one, but let us assume that the budget deficit which is run by the state, the United States, is split in two parts. Net savings for the American private sector and net savings for net exporters, China, but we forget to say Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and their likes. So, the existence condition for Chinese net savings, net profits of firms operating in China is the federal deficit. Thereby, the logical position should be by running a deficit, the United States as a nation may make a gift to China. So, logically, it is China which should be indebted to the Americans. So what happens? For reasons which have nothing to do with economics, but connected with the complexity of China's political structure. Firms which enjoy profits in dollars are obliged, at least were obliged, to transfer those dollars to the Chinese central bank, which accumulated reserves in dollars, and the counterpart was the creation of Chinese currency for firms. That was the policy of the Chinese Communist Party until recent time. So it is true that the Chinese central bank is accumulating reserves in dollars, which is a way of controlling the private sector. Like every central bank, the Central Bank of China is searching an income. People are forgetting that all central banks are enjoying enormous incomes. What do they do with their incomes is not always very clear. In Europe, it is a total mystery. So, until now, the central bank was not interested into financing investment in the US. The Chinese central bankers are very orthodox one. I knew one of them, and they didn't want that the central bank plays the role of an investor. So, what could they do? Buying private US assets? No. So, they had only one possibility: to buy bonds issued by the US, which granted an income. But doing so, they were not the least financing a deficit which had already been financed. And the sole way of reducing their holdings of bonds should be a total change in the economic policy decided by the economic and growth policy of the Chinese Communist Party. But they started to change. So, what about asking the US to pay back their debt? But I was told by a friend of James Galbraith, who was or is the chair of the economic policy, that they don't want to buy, they don't want to exert any pressure on the US. They need the support of the US. To buy euro, no. He told me we are not stupid. We are not the least confident into the euro. So finally, it means that as long as the state has the full control of its currency, doesn't surrender sovereignty to independent technocrats committee, as long as the state is really promoting or wishing to promote the growth of welfare and well-being of its people, it is not the least control in its expenditures. Thank you.
Bueno, vamos a ir a un receso nada más a 2 de la tarde. Entonces empezamos con las preguntas.
I shall start by answering 2 questions. The first is about China, and the second is about is happening with the financial market and Wall Street. But first, China. I have to be honest. The available documentation in English is scarce. Chinese official statistics are difficult to interpret. There is a book I recommend, but I forgot the name of the author. It has been published some months ago. Behind the walls, the role of the ruling Communist Party in China. It is a very interesting book. The author spent 12 years in Beijing. And he emphasized first that all is decided by secret committees within the party, that all the so-called Chinese wealthiest capitalists are all high-ranking members of the party, and that it is impossible to create and sustain a private firm without the full support of the Central Committee of the party. The second question, he says, and I think this is true, is that China is now suffering from three problems. First, the extreme decentralization of the Chinese economy. Each region has its own central committee, officially depending on Beijing, but sometimes not much. So they are running policies which are often in contradiction one with each other. The second problem of China is that the authorities are afraid of the expected fact that in the forthcoming 10 years, maybe 50 or 100 million people could migrate from the poorest agricultural part of the country to the industrialized part, which is concentrated into some very small areas of the country. How could the system survive? Because since Deng Xiaoping reforms taking care of what happened during the Cultural Revolution, the educational system collapsed. Universities are now more or less privatized, and the cost is enormous. So, the government accepts the fact that it will be obliged to run an enormous increase in expenditures to prevent a total collapse of the country. Third, the Chinese know that the exports-driven growth is over. That because of the collapse of Europe, because of the stagnation in North America, so they need to total reversal of their economic and social policy to promote growth in the domestic economy, which means increasing expenditures in education, raising productivity, which is very low, and they understand that it requires an increase in wages, real wages. There are strikes everywhere in China. Whatever the repression, and the party is more and more reluctant to rely on sheer force. So everything could change. What is certain is that China will never accept the development of a financial market. There is unanimity, it seems, in the economic policy of the party that there never will be a Chinese Wall Street, but will a marginal role. And that they are not ready, and they will never be ready to engage into conflict with the West, which means the United States. They have only contempt for the Eurozone. On this point, I agree with them. And there is a widespread idea, some kind of what is deemed China-America, some kind of economic condominium between China and the United States, which, by the way, was also targeted by Chiang Kai-shek before the collapse of his regime. Now, so low-cost growth is over. Real wages in China are much higher than in other parts of Asia, including the Pakistan, the Philippines Republic. And in parts of Europe, according to reliable sources, real wages in terms of purchasing power are higher in China, developed industry, than in the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Eastern Europe, some kind of a colonial empire of France and Germany. There are economic debates in China much more than in the United States, and of course than in Europe. And a very interesting question is the inability of the regime to deal with the legacy of Mao Zedong years and policy. It is still forbidden to write anything on the worst part of the Mao Zedong era, the so-called Great Leap Forward, where apparently 30 million people die, and the Cultural Revolution. They recognize what happened during the Cultural Revolution, where possibly 10 million people were liquidated. It is of course also forbidden to write and discuss the question of Tibet, but on Tibet we could speak for hours. There are courses in Beijing on history of economic thought, while they are suppressed in most of the Western universities, Keynes, post-Keynesians are studied. Marx also, because Zerail Clay said that they are following Marx deep thought that capitalism should only die because of over-accumulation. So official economists from the Central Committee said, but yes, Marx would have accepted our policy. But this is interesting. At least there are debates. About Wall Street, there are three questions. Capitalism as an entrepreneurial capitalism is dead. There are no more Thomas Edison, Andrew Carnegie, Rockefeller in the US. Only there are managers coming from business schools, which, according to the John Kenneth Galbraith, were the best recipe for the destruction of capitalism. I remember the last discussion I had with John Kenneth Galbraith on his bed. He said, if Trotsky, Lenin, and Stalin were still alive, they would support our business schools. They are much more efficient than any kind of extreme left-wing group. They form people, most of them are ignorance. But let us go further. When I said that capitalism as an entrepreneurial is dead and was evolving towards a parasite, a financial system, it raised two questions. The first is why, and the second is why Wall Street capitalism to austerity and always asking for less expenditures and balanced budget, which lead to the outcome that the United States are still without budget. Day per day, the administration has to rely on the most tricky ways to sustain the economic system. So the war between the Obama administration and the Congress seems some kind of an endless system, which is, and Obama being himself partly responsible of the situation. But first, why? Because when large corporations and banks are ruled by the same people with interlocked or crossed shareholding, they apply what they have been taught in their school to make the maximum of money in the minimum of time by running the minimum risk. Thereby, their shared ideology is that as being indebted to spend in the real economy does not allow to raise enough money. They are so panicked by the future that they don't want to invest in labor or equipment. Their preference for liquidity or speculation is absolute. So we are led to what I discussed before in some kind of a spiraling debt inflation. The majority of assets of corporations are financial assets of corporations, sorry, the so-called productive corporations is financial assets. The majority of banks' assets is loans to finance the accumulation of financial assets by corporations. But there was a time when such a behavior, such an horror of the state was not the same. As I told you, John Pierpont Morgan, the very one who created Wall Street, was a close friend and supporter to Franklin Roosevelt New Deal. Jean-Pierre Morgan invested money in Roosevelt campaign, even when Roosevelt was candidate for the second term. Morgan Bank at that time was mainly dealing with state debt. So what happened? It seemed that Pierpont Morgan was an intelligent, like all the so-called great robber barons of the late 19th century Gilded Age, and they understood that you couldn't accumulate wealth out of nothing. Pierpont Morgan, for instance, supported Roosevelt policies of directly creating employment. Imagine now the Wall Street people and the Wall Street creatures of the Obama administration, the Gettler and co, supporting the direct creation of jobs by the administration. Je would say no. Which is connected with the total change and counter cultural revolution in the United States and Europe. In some way, the Obama's people and Obama himself are much more conservative in terms of economic policy, like Clinton before, than the Republicans during the reign of Ronald Reagan and the two Bush. I don't defend at all the Bush administration. But the Bush people had only contempt for Wall Street. Thomas Ferguson, in the paper he wrote, Who Paid for Clinton, and now Who Paid for Obama, displays the proof that most of the money came from Wall Street, from the majority of Hollywood industry, high-tech industry, and they never invested into the Republicans. Thereby, the drama and the proof of the decadence and the decay of the capitalist system is, on one side, managers without any sound culture. I don't speak of interest in the welfare of population, are now in charge of both the financial system, the source of money creation, and political power. In some way, it never happened before. It never, the financial democrat managers, like the equivalent in Europe, are really both the cause and the mark of the total decadence of the system. I studied recently a book on the Gilded Age and the time of Theodore Roosevelt. I recommend also the wonderful movie Lincoln. Lincoln was the leader of the Republican Party. The Democrats were against and pro-slavery. They changed, but at that time there was still a political independent power. Business schools were not what they are now. Indeed, Rockefeller, Carnegie earned zillions of dollars, but they created the modern world. I remember Churchill, he said, to have been shocked by the enormous wealth of the American elite. But Churchill himself came from the richest family in the US. His father was the Duke of Westminster, who is still the richest guy in the Europe. 2/3 of the billionaires in pounds in Britain are from the high aristocracy. They created nothing, while the American billionaires, they created the modern world. Without Rockefeller, maybe for the better or the best, oil will never have been a source of energy. But without oil, what could have been the modern world? So, the problem is how to deal with this question. I should address, but I am always impressed by the absolute indifference of those financial technocrats earning gigantic amount of money for creating nothing, doing nothing, and destroying everything. People are accusing the Mexican drug lords or the Colombian drug lords. But what is the difference between the drug lords and the young Wall Street managers? Both destroy. The one directly, the other indirectly. If there is an enormous increase in the consumption of drugs and hard drugs everywhere in the Western world, it is because of the collapse of society. Without demand, there will not be drug lords. So we should remember that when Franklin Roosevelt decided to start the New Deal with the advice of Jean-Pierre Morgan, he invited all the leading bankers and Wall Street guys in his private property, with the new head of the FBI, Edgar Hoover, with an enormous amount of files. And he said, the bankers, your office should be in Alcatraz, in a federal jail, not in your mansions. So the bankers were silenced. In the movie I spoke of, when Lincoln is told that there are 20 Democrats who could vote against abolition and kill the bill, he said, I am commander-in-chief. Find me those 20 people. The Congress is for sale. It just depends on the price. And Thomas Ferguson told recently Barack Obama, the Congress is on sale. You should know that. You could find 20 or 30 people that could be sent to a federal jail for life. So we have no more political leaders. I don't want, of course, political leaders in the like of Hitler and Stalin, but political leaders with the will of leadership and with the will of acting for the people and indifferent to the bankers' absolute inability to cope with the uncertainty of the future. And it's the same in Europe, you see. Corruption is everywhere. Everybody knows that.
Thank you. Bueno, creo que podemos recibir una pregunta más. Una pregunta no se puede. César.
I would like to ask, it wasn't...
There is no micro. Yes.
It wasn't very clear to me the role of taxes in the economy. Well, you said they didn't serve to finance the government because the expenditures were already financed, but I didn't understand why there must be taxes.
Why? Why there must be taxes? Oh yes. A very good question. Taxes in the modern economy. I don't address societies too far in the past. They play two roles. First, you could demonstrate, which I did, that all taxes are finally raised by workers, and I use the term workers in the sense of Marx. Marx spelled of Arbeiter, those who work, including workers, professors, students. Marx thought has been simplified. So, all taxes are levied on workers. Thereby, all taxes or contributions are ultimately decreasing consumption. Thereby, the role of taxation is to allow the rise in consumption, sustaining the rise of private investment, and to be added to the impact of the state deficit. What is happening now is that under the impact of archaeoliberalism, we are back to some pre-Keynesian, Ricardian wisdom. Consumption is bad. Saving is good. And the sole way of promoting investment is to reduce the consumption. It is why we must reject any policy of increasing taxation. And I am supporting taxation, I am supporting, a decline of taxation as long as it is effectively squeezing income and consumption. The second role of taxation, if we had a truly people-orientated government, would be to prevent the evolution towards rentier, decadent capitalism by a sharp increase on taxation, on managers' income, Wall Street people, and their likes. it is not a question to redistributing wealth, but to prevent the abuse of pure rentier financial capitalism. And what is going now, taxation is increased everywhere, and who is supporting the burden of taxation? Working people, retired people, not managers. Everybody knows that there should be near, I would say, confiscating taxation of incomes earned by the ruling managers of owners of Goldman Sachs and their likes. It's absolutely a scandal in terms of social and economic theory and policy. But we are evolving towards the inverse. And the worst is what is happening in Europe, but it's such a disaster. Maybe it doesn't deserve more comment. As for a balanced budget, I also, a long time ago, brought about the proof that the so-called Avelmo theorem, the balanced budget multiplier, is not one, it is negative, -0, and strongly negative. And it could end because it leads to a decrease in consumption, in employment and consumption. It is why we should be very cautious with pseudo-econometrics.
Bueno, una última pregunta, Pati. ¿Quién dio la palabra? Claudia, por favor.
Doctor Parguez,
Más fuerte o... el micrófono. That's fine.
Oh.
No está encendido. ¿Se enciende?
At the beginning of your conference this morning, you talked about a good deficit. Also, you have talked about that good deficit and bad deficit in some of your papers, but you didn't explain us not just the difference, but what are the impacts of bad deficit. We understand kind of good deficits, but please, could you explain more about that? Okay,
Yes.
that's important.
Let me. I shall try to be brief on the fascinating question. Bon. Bad deficits are the outcome of official state policy targeting zero deficit or a surplus. So they are the outcome of the strong negative impact of policies of austerity at a time when there is already some tendency of the private capitalist sector to fly away from the real economy. Whatever the rate of taxation and the structure of taxes, the sharp decline, drop in state expenditures, especially in the Eurozone. I don't think that even the most hawkish Republicans will accept what is implemented by the so-called socialist parties in the Eurozone. But the impact of those policies is obviously a strong decline of private income, thereby a strong decline in tax revenue, thereby taxes drop more than state expenditures, thereby the state which had taken the oath to abolish the deficit find itself with enormous, unwanted, unexpected deficits. Before the early years of this century, or maybe if I take the case of what happened in the US and Europe since the early 70s, the state should change its policy. But now, no. They are so much addicted to their atonement punitive policy that what do? They cut more taxes, they cut more in expenditures, and they increase taxation. So growth becomes negative, collapse of tax revenue, more deficits, more deflation, and so we are engaged because of that fanatism, Talibanism, if I dare say, of the political ruling class into a spiraling disaster. And the private sector will react from its own side by cutting more its own expenditures private investment will collapse, or they will fly to China, not to the Philippine Republic, or to Eastern Europe. So, more drop in private income, more fall in tax revenue, and we are going really to some kind of implosion of the system. And what is interesting is what happened after the outcome of the elections in Italy, which are obviously some kind of revolt of the people. The ex-prime minister understood, and now he is in Harvard. Because the leader of the new party, Beppe Grillo, said that he should have been indicted of high treason against the people. But 4 days ago, there was an emergency meeting in Frankfurt, organized by the chief